squared, M squared. Today I'm going to nerd out for James Bond. I'll tell you how I became a fan, why I think the franchise is as popular as it is, and I'll tell you who I believe is the best Bond. When I was 10 or 11, my dad rented Diamonds Are Forever, and as soon as James Bond tipped his car on its side and drove down an alley on 2 tires, I was a fan. My dad supported my fandom by renting more movies and going to the bookstore and getting me copies of the books to read. I also got James Bond encyclopedias and tried to absorb as many factoids as I could. I mean, I can tell you what Q's real name is. Now, I might not be as rabid a fan as I was back then, but I'm still a fan, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing No Time to Die when it comes out in November. Now, the franchise has been around for over half a century at this point. So what makes it so popular, and why has it endured this long? To start, I want to say that while James Bond might not be the OG in terms of fictional spies, I would give that title to The Scarlet Pimpernel. He is the original when we're talking about more modern espionage, and certainly when we're talking about film franchises. We wouldn't have Jack Ryan or Jason Osborne if we didn't have James Bond. Obviously, part of what makes Bond popular is it's that same narrative of good versus evil. We know that our anti-hero is going to prevail over the villain each time we go in and see another Bond film. But there are a lot of more specific things about the franchise that appeal to a wide variety of people. You could almost say that there's something for everyone. For starters, let's talk about the action. There are lots of great action sequences in the Bond franchise and a lot of variety with them. You have car chases, boat chases, you have fights on airplanes, on trains, you have underwater fighting, you have fighting while you're skiing down a hill. There's so many different varieties of fighting and really good choreography for those fight scenes. And related to that, the stunts that are being performed in a lot of the Bond films are really impressive. For example, the opening scene of GoldenEye has a bungee drop that actually made the Guinness Book of World Records. You also have the gadgets, so people who are tech-minded tune in to see what Q is going to come up with next. Which gizmo is Bond going to use to get out of a pickle this time? There's also always a love interest. Now, love might be a strong word to use for a lot of what's going on in the Bond films, but certainly there is that element. And then something that might not be as obvious, but that I think is probably pretty compelling for audiences, is you have a good mix of the familiar and the novel. So we go into a Bond film and we know that Bond is going to prevail over the villain, but we also know that we're probably going to see M, Q, Miss Moneypenny, Felix Leiter. There's this whole world that we've become familiar with and a cast of characters that we've become familiar with that we expect to see in continuity throughout the films. At the same time, with a few exceptions like Blofeld, with every movie, we know we're going to get a new villain, new henchman, and a new peril for Bond to save the world from. So it's a good blend of the familiar and the novel. Now, the reason why I think that Bond has endured over all this time is that the franchise has also evolved over time. Certainly, if the franchise was still putting out movies that are Cold War era, mentality and plot lines, then the franchise would have died out. But the franchise evolves as our society evolves, as the geopolitical systems and events that are sort of at the forefront of our mind change. The Bond films change to better reflect the society as it is each year that the film is released. So, who is the best Bond? Now, it's important to keep in mind that when you have this discussion, it's completely subjective, because what metric are you using? Different people are going to use different metrics. A producer, for example, would probably argue that the best Bond is whoever brought in the most money for the franchise. I think that a lot of fans, when they choose the best Bond, they're really choosing their favorite Bond. I think there's very few people where their favorite and who they consider the best are two different people. And a lot of times, who we pick as our favorite and therefore best is based on who was the Bond that introduced us to the franchise. So people who grew up when, Roger Moore was Bond are probably going to pick Roger Moore. People who first saw the Connery films are probably going to pick Connery. This isn't true for everybody, obviously. I think that there are also some people who would say Connery simply because he was the first, and their metric is, well, the first is best, just like they would say George Washington is the best president simply because he was the first. And that's fine, because that's the metric they're using. The metric that I'm using is, I read the books, and I want the Bond of the films to reflect the Bond of the books. And for that reason, I believe the best Bond is Timothy Dalton. Now, Timothy Dalton doesn't get a lot of love. And part of that is because he was only in 2 films, so he didn't have as long of a time to build up a fan base like other Bond actors have. There's another reason that some people don't like Dalton as well, and it's actually the reason why I do like Dalton, and that is because he is more serious. Because the Bond of the books is more serious. So, for example, I remember one of the Bond books opening with Bond having a hangover and being kind of depressed because the woman he was having sex with in the previous novel had left. So he's kind of heartbroken. We do not see this in Bond films. We never see him hungover. We very rarely see him heartbroken, except like OHMSS and Casino Royale. Other than that, he doesn't care about women, right? He's the ultimate womanizer, and he views them as objects. We don't see him getting emotional in any way except for like anger and lust, really. We don't see him get rattled. But that's this gloss that most of the films have put on Bond that is not there in the books. So Roger Ebert wrote this review of The Living Daylights, and one of the problems that he had with the movie was this scene where Bond is sliding down a hill in a cello case. And Ebert is complaining that Bond looks like he might not make it. And I read this review when I was maybe 13, and I wrote Roger Ebert a letter. And I said, you're missing the point. Like, that's what makes him good, because that's what Fleming's Bond would do. Fleming's Bond was a human being. And while you can't make the argument that he's super realistic, he's much more realistic than Bond is portrayed in most of the movies. He's much more human. And so having Timothy Dalton portray Bond that way, it was the first time that that happened. And it's certainly what I would say makes him the best Bond. Or the most important thing that makes him the best Bond. He does have a couple other things going for him. Again, not as important, but certainly extra little feathers in his cap. One is that he's also the most physically like Fleming's Bond. So in the books, Fleming describes his Bond as having blue-gray eyes and black hair with a comma that always falls over his forehead. I always loved that description of the comma that always falls over his forehead, because you know exactly what Fleming means when you read that. And Dalton, more than anyone else, embodies that physical description of Bond. Another thing that I think is impressive about Dalton is that he did a lot of his own stunts. Again, the most important thing for me is that his behavior, his acting, was most like Bond's behavior and portrayal in the books. So that's who I would argue is the best Bond. I think Daniel Craig might come in second for me for the same reason, because he does bring a return to that grittier side of Bond that's more like the books. I do want to talk a little bit about some of the movies, because when you're talking who is the best Bond, you kind of naturally maybe want to talk about, well, what's the best Bond film? For me, I think it's easier to say what is the worst Bond film than what is the best. There are lots of discussions about this online, and there are a lot of people who don't like Die Another Day because they have a problem with that CGI car. But for me, easily the worst Bond film is Moonraker. Jaws Gets a Girlfriend. That in and of itself should be enough to convince you that it is the worst. But I will also add that I think that most of the film is forgettable. It's a forgettable plot line. It's a forgettable villain. It's a forgettable Bond woman. In fact, until I rewatched the movies recently in quarantine, I had forgotten all of Moonraker except for the fact that Jaws Gets a Girlfriend, because it is so ridiculous and cheesy. So, Moonraker is the worst. The best. Now, for me, there is a difference between what I would say is my favorite Bond film and what I would say is the best Bond film. So first I'm going to tell you about my favorite Bond film, since this is a nerd out, and I'm going to completely nerd out and do show and tell. It should probably come as no surprise to you, given that Timothy Dalton is my favorite Bond, that The Living Daylights is my favorite Bond film. This is obviously a Greek movie poster that I picked up in Greece. It's one of my prized possessions. But Living Daylights is my favorite, not just because it's the first Dalton film, and it's such a stark contrast to the Roger Moore films that come before it. You have this cheesy, like extra jokey Bond, and then suddenly, boom, you have this representation of the Bond that I recognize from the books. Super refreshing and wonderful. So that's a big part of why it's my favorite, but there are other reasons. One is just a personal reason. I used to watch this movie a lot with my brother, so it reminds me of spending time with my bro. But I also really like the film for itself, for the plot. I think it's an interesting plot line. I think that a lot of the characters that show up in this film are interesting characters. I like the fact that there is only one Bond woman in it. Cara Mallovi is the character's name. Now, people say that probably that was a result of this being released, I think it was 1987, released in the midst of the AIDS crisis, and so it was a way to sort of dial back on the casual sex and be more responsible. But regardless of what the reason is, I think the movie really benefits from there only being one Bond woman in it, because it creates the development of an actual relationship, of a believable relationship, and then as part of that, some character development that goes on. I also think that Cara Mallovi is a likable Bond woman. She's much more realistic than a lot of Bond women. She's more natural. She evolves over the course of the film. She is someone that by the time you're getting to the airport, I'll talk about the movie, but there won't be any like real spoilers in it. By the time you get to some of the fight scenes in the airport, like, she's willing to get physical and fight. But again, that's portrayed in a really realistic way as a character who is not a trained operative. So of course she's not going to be able to like beat people up the way that Bond could. But she does what she can, and she is effective, and she does go after like what she wants. And she's a talented musician. There's a lot to like about her. So it's also interesting to watch now, because again, at the time, we're talking about the 1980s. Part of it takes place in Afghanistan, and Bond allies himself with a member of the Mujahideen. And so looking back on it now, knowing like what happened in Afghanistan after that, and how the Mujahideen sort of dissolved or disappeared, and some of the members sort of morphed into the Taliban, and what happened when the Soviets left Afghanistan and all of that. Knowing that now and looking back and watching this film is really interesting. I also really like the music in the film. So the theme song is by a-ha, but the Pretenders do 2 different songs that show up in the film and in the end credits that are like fun songs. But the score itself, and I think it's John Barry, is really enjoyable to listen to. I actually own the soundtrack of this score that, again, is enjoyable to listen to without even, having the movie. So there's a lot to recommend the movie. If you haven't seen it, check it out. But I would not argue that it is the best Bond film. I think that when people have this discussion of the best Bond film, a lot of people like to automatically jump to Goldfinger because it, pun intended, maybe sets the gold standard for Bond films. You have the really memorable henchman with Odd Job, and you have the iconic line of, "Do you expect me to talk? No, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die." And again, that iconic scene of the Masterson girl painted gold. And of course, there are some people who are going to pick a Connery film regardless because it's early on in the canon. However, I don't think that I want to make the argument that Goldfinger is the best film. I'm going to argue for Casino Royale. And part of it is because, right, it's that reboot of the series. It's a successful reboot of going back to essentially what Dalton was doing, of making Bond much grittier and realistic. And Casino Royale especially, not just because it's the first of the Craigs and first of that return to a grittier, more realistic Bond, but it's also that relationship between Bond and Vesper that drives a lot of the film, but is also driving character development. I think that Casino Royale, more than any other Bond film, shows character development in Bond himself. And that, I think, is the number one reason why I would recommend it as the best Bond film. It has other things going for it, of course, right? I think that Le Chiffre is a very memorable villain. The parkour scene in the opening of the movie, well, not the very, very beginning, but toward the beginning of the movie, the parkour scene with the chase and the fight is extraordinary, incredibly impressive to watch. I also enjoy the theme song because it's Chris Cornell. And there's a lot there, I think, to recommend it as the best film, mostly because Bond is, you're discovering who Bond is, you're discovering sort of his origins, and you're watching his character develop, and he is experiencing real human emotions and is portrayed more as a human being and with less of that gloss that we see on Connery, Moore, and Brosnan. So that's what I would argue as the best Bond film. Again, I think it's harder to make that discernment for me than it is to say what's the worst Bond film. I certainly understand why people would say Goldfinger. But what do you think? Leave a note in the comments. What would you say is the best Bond film? Who do you think is the best Bond actor? Have you read the books? And how does that then affect the way that you view the films? Give us a like if you liked it, and hit subscribe to get more nerd outs. See you next time.